So recently I made a video covering some tips and tricks for Baldur's Gate 3, and since it would seem that a lot of you newcomers appreciated that video, and after messing around a bunch in the early access, which you'll catch me doing over on twitch.tv/MrHulthen, today I'll be providing you with some additional tips and tricks that will most likely be relevant for the full version of Baldur's Gate 3. Now, just like I mentioned last time, things could be subject to change with this list, but as of now, these things don't seem to have been changed in the final game. Speaking of which, let's start off with tip number 1. In the last video, I mentioned that you should pick a class and race combination that works best because of the different stats you get depending on race in early access. However, this will no longer be the case in the full game, as according to a recent video by Fextralife, instead your stats will be based on class, so feel free to pick any race and class combination in the full game. Just remember though that your class and race combination will still be very important because of the interactions you get throughout the game, so choose carefully for your first playthrough. Alright, now let's move on to tip number 2. Turn off the Karmic Dice setting. Now this one might seem a little bit contradictory because what the Karmic Dice setting does is that it balances the chances of all dice rolls. For instance, it supposedly reduces the possibility of you getting several bad rolls in a row. However, just like everything else in Baldur's Gate 3, this goes both ways, meaning it also makes sure that all NPCs, including enemies, also has Karmic Dice rolls. And according to Reddit poster AKDavidXY, having Karmic Dice on could result in you taking upwards of 400% more damage compared to if you'd have it off, simply because enemies will be hitting you significantly more than they should. Now these numbers haven't exactly been confirmed by Larian, but after trying this myself, it would seem that it's a pretty good idea to turn it off right after crashing on the beach, because I noticed quite an improved number of successful rolls after the Nautiloid part. Now have in mind, your experience might be different and you could actually get worse rolls with Karmic Dice off, but I highly recommend that you experiment with having it off. Now for tip number 3, in case you get a bad roll during a dialogue scene, you will sometimes have access to something called Inspiration, and this is essentially a reroll. You can have up to 4 stacks of Inspiration, and you get these Inspiration points from completing certain goals for various teammates. As an example, Shadowheart approves of you being honorable and helping people, so having her in your group while doing things like saving people or similar things like that will sometimes earn you an inspiration point, which you can then use to re-roll. Now while we're on the topic of dice rolls, let's move on to number 4, which is to use light to your advantage. In Baldur's Gate 3, it's super important to have a high hit chance, and missing your attacks can mean life or death for you and your team. This is especially the case for any dark areas in the game, such as the Underdark. Now, most races in the game has access to something called Dark Vision, which lets them see up to 12 meters in darkness, and Drow have something called Superior Dark Vision, which allows them to see up to 24 meters. However, humans, Githyanki, and halflings don't have access to dark vision, meaning that if you have someone like Lizelle in your party, a good idea would be to use the light cantrip on her to make sure that she doesn't get a penalty to her sight in dark areas. Trust me, light is much more important than you might think at first. Tip number 5. Did you know that you don't need to actually have a target while using AoE abilities such as Bless or Bane? Yep, that's right. You can actually just drop your AoE spells in an area, and if your team member or the enemy is standing within the spell's borders, the individual in question will be affected by the spell. Tip number 6. Some supplies that you find can be consumed. Mind you, however, most supplies cannot be consumed, only some, so don't expect to be chowing down a bunch of sausages to restore your HP while in a fight. I also want to mention here that it's entirely possible that Larian has removed this feature entirely in the full game, but as of now, there are still some foods that restore health, albeit very few of them. Tip number 7. You can combine items to create new items, like the spear called Vision of the Absolute, which you can get from combining 2 pieces of a broken spear. There are definitely going to be more occasions where you'll be combining things in the full game, so remember this tip if you find something that seems to be a part of something else. Tip number 8. Make sure to bring at least one character that has access to Feather Fall, which is a group-wide spell that allows you to land without taking fall damage. Not only is this invaluable for melee fighters during battles, but it also allows you to access areas and shortcuts that might seem too dangerous to explore at first hand, Which brings us to tip number 9. Use Featherfall to jump into the huge, scary-looking pit in the Whispering Depths. Now, I mentioned in my last video that you shouldn't jump into the pit, but that was before a few of you guys commented about the use of Featherfall. So remember to use it to get access to the Underdark, but be careful as there are some very powerful enemies patrolling the area that you land in. Tip number 10. Remember to fully rest at your camp before engaging in seemingly important events or dialogue scenes. This is very important if you want to make friends in high places, and having access to all of your party's ability bonuses will make the chances of winning your roles much more likely. And if you're someone who's looking to get the best possible outcome for every dialogue scene, then remember this tip. Tip number 11. Did you know that you can stack boxes and other containers? And did you also know that you can use this to your advantage to reach more elevated places? No? Well, you can use different containers as platforms for you to jump onto, which will then allow you to jump to an even higher area. This tip is especially helpful for players who roll classes that aren't necessarily the greatest jumpers, like sorcerers and wizards. Just know that some of these stacked boxes need to be placed in certain spots in order to make them into platforms, so you might have to experiment with their placement sometimes. Tip number 12. If you've hoarded a bunch of equipment and valuables that you want to sell, a good idea is to station yourself right next to a vendor and then go to your camp to retrieve items from your storage chest. You can then just simply leave the camp and your character will still be right next to the vendor, so you can just simply dump all your collected valuables, then rinse and repeat. Remember to do this as soon as you're near a vendor, or you might just end up stacking a bunch of items that you can only sell a select few of, because traders in Baldur's Gate 3 do not have infinite gold. Their gold does get replenished between long rests though, which is why it's a good idea to sell off items often. Speaking of selling off your inventory, this brings us to tip number 13. If you're playing on PC, remember to use Tab to bring up the inventory of all your party members. This makes it much easier to not only sell off unwanted items, but it also is so much easier to swap around equipment and items between characters by bringing up all of their inventories. Now, I'll admit that this was something that I didn't think about for the longest time, and there seems to be quite a number of newcomers that don't actually know that you can do this. In any case, thank you to everyone who suggested this to me, and I kind of feel a little bit dumb for not realizing this sooner, but hey! Now for number 14, here's yet another tip that people generally miss out on. Remember that you can highlight items in close proximity to you. This little tip is invaluable since a lot of items and interactables might blend in with the environment, making them hard to see in some cases. Thankfully, you can bind actions to any key you want, but Alt is the standard button for highlighting stuff. Finally, number 15. Did you know that as a barbarian you can actually throw people? Yep, that's right. Not only can you throw stuff as any class, but if you grow sick of some ugly gobbo as a barbarian, you can just toss that fucker straight off a cliff.
Remember, Sally, when I promised to kill you last?
That's right, Major. You did.
I lied.
Unga bunga, my friend. Unga bunga. And that's it for this list. Remember to comment below with any of your own tips and tricks that you want to share with the community. And thank you to all my wonderful Ensven Squad members for supporting the channel. And as always, have a great day everyone. MrHulthen, signing out.